There is a coffee shop not too far from where I live called Sip of Hope. And besides offering very tasty coffee and tea beverages, Sip of Hope is the only coffee shop in the entire world where 100% of the proceeds go to support suicide prevention and mental health awareness. It was actually just featured on the Today Show. It's a really cool project that's going on. And all the people who are employed by Sip of Hope are trained in mental health awareness. And if someone wants to come and to talk to them, they have a number of resources on hand that they can refer them to. And besides all these wonderful things that the shop is doing, it's also just a cool place to go and grab a cup of joe and meet up with some friends and plug into the internet, if you will. But the motto, one of the main mottos of Sip of Hope that they have printed on their mugs and on the wall when you walk into the coffee shop is, "It's okay not to be okay. It's okay not to be okay." Sip of Hope does a wonderful job reminding people that no matter who they are, where they're coming from, what they have experienced, they are valued and they are important. Every time I go to the shop, I can't help but think about how so much of Jesus' ministry was letting the people around him know and the people he encountered of their true identity, that they were children of God, meant for relationship with God, that they were God's beloved, and that nothing will ever take away from that, no matter who they are or where they're coming from. Every time I go into the shop too, I can't help but think that every one of us here, every once in a while, probably needs a little bit of a sip of hope in our own lives here and there. Now, on the surface of this somewhat strange and weird gospel lesson, Jesus is portrayed as a healer. He casts out the demons of a man who, at the time, in the ancient times, displayed all the signs of someone who was possessed by an unclean spirit. But if we dig a little bit deeper into this gospel story, the story also reveals Jesus not only someone who heals, but also someone who crosses boundaries and someone who works to liberate us from those occupying forces that can prevent us from living as a people created in God's image. But let's start with the healing aspect, because that's an important one. Towards the beginning of Jesus' gospel, Jesus sort of summarizes his ministry by saying that he comes to bring good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the captives, to restore sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free. It's kind of like Jesus' mission statement at the beginning of Luke's gospel. And in the story that we hear this morning, the man who is possessed by the demon, by Legion, very much represents the ultimate outcast. He is excluded from the community. He's running around naked. He lives in the tombs. And being around dead bodies in the Jewish culture made one ritually unclean. So there's a lot going on about this guy that made him an outcast. And yet, it is to this man that Jesus works to heal. He casts out the demons, sending them into the swineherd that then go tromping off into the Sea of Galilee. I told you, it's kind of a bizarre story when you think about it all. It's just kind of a weird thing. But Jesus' transformation of this man who was once naked and possessed, and who at the end of this story is clothed and in his right mind and sitting next to Jesus, exemplifies this theme of reversal that is very much a part of Luke's gospel. Jesus goes to those people and to those places who we think are beyond repair and works to restore them to their true identity, to let them know that they are God's beloved. It's an important piece of this story, and also an important piece of Luke's gospel overall, and one that we should not lose sight of. Now, let's dig a little bit deeper into this lesson, because there are some important issues that pop up aspects of this story that would have caught the attention of people who heard the story in the first century, but that we as modern listeners might gloss over. For example, at the very beginning of the story, we hear how Jesus and his disciples cross over and head over to the country of the Gerasenes. Now, Gerasa, the city of Gerasa, was a predominantly non-Jewish city. It was associated with an area and part of an area that was very devoted to Greek language and Greek culture. It had a worldview that was very much focused on the gymnasium and the theater and Greek gods and goddesses. And for Jesus and his disciples, who associated with and lived in predominantly these tight-knit Jewish communities, going over to the country of the Gerasenes, the city of Gerasa, meant leaving their familiar world. They were going to the other side. They were going to a city that did not keep the laws of Moses, and because of it, it was deemed to be unclean. So them heading over there was a big deal. As Rob Bell says, it would have been for some of these young disciples, the disciples who followed Jesus, probably in their late teenage years, they probably would have said something to each other like, "Dude, if my dad finds out about this, we are so busted." Jesus and his disciples are crossing boundaries. Now, the other aspect of this story that would have caused first century listeners' ears to perk up a little bit is the connection that the author makes to Roman oppression. When Jesus asks the man who's possessed his name, the man replies and says that his name is Legion. Now, a legion in the Roman world referred to one thing: a group of about 6,000 Roman soldiers. A legion was the representation of Roman military occupation, very much so. And furthermore, and I'm going to drop some history on you here, so don't fall asleep on this part, but the first century historian Josephus recorded that in the Jewish revolt, towards the end of the Jewish revolt in the first century, that the Roman general Vespasian sent a group of Roman soldiers over to the city of Gerasa to retake it. There had been some sort of uprising. And when these Roman soldiers went over to the city of Gerasa, Josephus recorded that they killed 1,000 young men in the city of Gerasa, that they plundered their families, and they burned the city to the ground. Now, I mention all of this because around the time the authors were writing the gospel lessons, the city of Gerasa had been through its own fair share of Roman brutality. And the author of this story uses language that would evoke the experience of living under this brutal oppression from the Roman Empire. There's political significance to this, political significance indeed. And the story is told in such a way that when Jesus casts off Legion, he's not only casting off demons, but he's casting off those occupying and oppressive forces that are working to destroy human life. This gospel lesson challenges us. It challenges us to think about how Jesus calls us to respond to the oppressive forces in our own world in this day and age. The retired biblical studies professor and an Episcopal priest named Judith Jones asks some important questions. She asks, how many people in our world are haunted by a traumatic past and tortured by memories? How many live unsheltered and inadequately clothed because of social and economic forces that they cannot overcome, no matter how hard they struggle? How many are imprisoned, regarded as barely human, excluded, cast out? How many are enslaved by addictions, no longer knowing where the addiction ends and their own selves begin? Where do the governing authorities separate people from their families, denying them the opportunity to seek better lives? Where do occupying armies still brutalize entire communities and hold them captive, to fear. This morning's gospel lesson tells us that Jesus comes to disrupt and to cast off those forces that prevent us from living as people created in God's image. Even in a world that at times can devalue and destroy life, Jesus works to remind us of our true identity, that we are God's beloved, that we are valued, and that nothing will ever take away from that. How are we working to confront the systems of oppression in our own day and age? How are we working to be a sip of hope to the people around us, reminding them that they are God's beloved and nothing will ever take away from that? Amen.